joining us for Core Volunteer Training. It's a weekly webinar program to create and support our volunteers, especially newer ones around the world, to connect with each other and empower you to achieve your larger goals for climate advocacy. This week's essential topic is the economics of carbon fee and dividend policies. And joining us is our wonderful esteemed speaker, Robert Archer. I'm your host, Brett Cease, and I want to thank you for joining us, and feel free to put any questions you might have in the chat as we proceed along. Bob Archer is an economist by training with a BA from Yale and a master's from the University of Pittsburgh. He's a former Peace Corps volunteer and worked on energy reform, regulatory development, and energy efficiency in Eastern Europe, the former Soviet Union, South and Southeast Asia, with US AID, the Agency for International Development. Bob comes to us tonight with over 30 years of experience working on economic policy for national and Washington, D.C. interests. And he also serves generously on the steering committee for the Marin, California chapter, as well as the co-lead of the CCL Economic Policy Network action team. With our focus tonight, we're going to have the following 3 learning goals. You're going to have a chance to review the rationale behind the 3 legs for policies like the Energy Innovation Act, carbon fee and dividend policies. You're going to have a chance to start describing each of those policy components in your own words and how they function together, and really begin to address some of the economic issues related to each of those legs or areas that others often raise in questions. And to get us there, Bob's going to take us through a really simple agenda. We'll have a quick background, and then we'll have a chance to discuss all 3 of those policy elements: the fee, the dividend, and the adjustment, and some of the economic background and considerations for each. So with that, I'll make sure that you're unmuted, Bob, and thank you all for joining us tonight. You are in for a real treat, and here we go.
Thank you, Brett. I want to lead off with 2 slides to provide context. First, the challenge is global. There are billions of individuals, millions of firms, thousands of governments, hundreds of nations, and for them to take action, they're going to have incentives. We can raise the price of goods and services that are carbon intensive. A quote of Nobel economist William Nordhaus. The policies the U.S. puts in place must be workable in developing countries where most climate emissions are occurring. The second slide shows people's concerns about a carbon tax. A synthesis of 26 studies was done to identify how to make carbon taxes more acceptable. It showed 4 main concerns: that personal costs were too high, negative impact on low-income households, that people mistrust governments and think they just want the revenues and not really emissions reductions, and fourth, that it's not effective in discouraging high carbon behavior. Now, the beauty of CCL policy is that the first 3 are addressed directly by the equitable dividend. And the study found that number 4, the lack of understanding that a carbon fee reduces emissions, leads people to favor spending revenues on clean energy projects instead of a carbon dividend, which hurts low and middle income households. The good news is that when people understand that the fee reduces emissions, the dividend becomes the preference over clean energy expenditures. So we in CCL need to continue to communicate that the carbon fee is effective and revenues should protect low and middle income households. Unlike the previous slide, these business concerns are not necessarily drawn from research, but you'll see through the presentation how the CCL fee, dividend, and border carbon adjustment address business concerns. Now, let's start with the basic economics underpinning the fee in the CCL policy. Why a fee? You raise the price of fossil fuels and demand goes down and emissions go down. This connection is not sufficiently understood or accepted. Our climate problem is due to a major market failure, resulting in negative external costs. It's called a Pigouvian external cost as the economic term. When a factory dumps its pollution, such as CO2 in the air and water, the cost falls on us, not them. So there's no incentive for the polluter to change. And here's where the polluter pay principle applies. CCL's carbon fee puts the cost back on the cause of the pollution, fossil fuels. This is the 100th anniversary of Arthur Pigou, whose economic treatise on externalities laid the groundwork for all this. You know, to date, our focus has been on the power of the fee to reduce emissions. There's a second and important impact, the power to accelerate clean energy innovation. There's a point of view that research and development is all we need, no carbon fee. That came up in the Energy and Commerce hearings on Capitol Hill. And such a view ignores the history of oil and gas. They also continue to innovate, horizontal drilling, fracking, big data. However, there's a widely held view among academics, industry, and innovators that a carbon fee will accelerate innovation and speed market adoption by providing strong incentives and by making fossil fuels more expensive. Nobel economist Paul Romer's view reflects the CCL policy of starting with a low carbon fee and escalating that price. You probably are aware of this, that the fee is to start at $15 a ton of CO2 and rise $10 each year, or $15 a year if emission targets aren't met. Most other proposals in Congress start higher and escalate slower. The fee over a decade is going to bring in a lot of money, somewhere between $2.5 and $3 trillion. Why a rising fee? Any carbon pricing policy won't do. This rising fee sends a powerful economy-wide signal for investment and innovation, unlike regulation or cap and trade, which have not provided the trajectory, predictability, or environmental certainty as academic theory contends. So why aren't carbon prices higher around the world? Politicians are wary because their countries do not have a household dividend, which protects households, or a border carbon adjustment to keep their industries on a level playing field. Starting low and escalating, why do you do that? You want to avoid an economic shock with a high price right off the bat. That prevents the early political backlash, allows time for companies to adjust, and it provides a clear long-term signal for behavior change. This is something called tax salience. It's a field of economic research that shows that people are more likely to change their behavior in response to highly visible and highly salient taxes compared to what would happen with traditional market swings in prices like gasoline. And there are a lot of other reasons to support a fee and dividend: the simplicity, transparency, efficiency, effectiveness, administrative ease, and a good fit for developing countries, which is something that is not given sufficient attention. Why call it a fee? You've probably heard the charge that it's the same as a tax, but a fee is an appropriate term. It's commonly used for environmental programs that assign costs to pollution activities like garbage collection. But maybe the best reason comes from George Shultz, a CCL advisor and former Secretary of the Treasury to President Ronald Reagan, when he told CCL that it's not a tax if the government doesn't keep the money. The administration of the fee. Carbon fee and dividend can use existing IRS and Treasury Department procedures and avoid creating new bureaucracies, which minimizes the risk of abuse and corruption. The fee is applied upstream. That is, as close as possible to the coal mine, the well, and the point of importation. For coal, the fee could be imposed at the mine or approximately 500 coal preparation plants. There's an IRS excise tax form, 720, where you would just have to basically add one line. For oil and gas, the fee can be placed on approximately 140 refineries or 500 some gas processing plants. So the bottom line is this is manageable. This is an important one that's pretty well established that the fee impact on emissions is significant. The Stanford Energy Modeling Forum forecast reductions of 26 to 47%, depending upon trajectories and prices, by 2030, exceeding Paris and the former Clean Power Plan targets. And the REMI study shows a decline of 33% in 10 years and over 50% in 20 years. U.S. service industries, retail, healthcare, are shown to benefit the most. However, remember that the modeling does not really come close to capturing all the benefits. They generally don't capture health benefits, local emissions reductions, or the accelerated innovation that will occur. What's the impact on household energy costs? They'll rise about 5 to 10% with the initial $15 a ton fee. This will stimulate awareness and initiation of change behavior without economic shock and political backlash. The average U.S. home energy bill for a family of four is about $2,060 a year, spread among heating, cooling, water, heating, appliances, lighting, electronics, etc. So a 10% increase is about $200 a year, and the first year dividend will be approximately $750 for family four. So the rising costs will be more than covered. Now, here's some good news. We've heard this narrative that a carbon tax is a job and economy killer. And to date, we've depended upon climate economic forecasting models like the Standard Form to refute this. But that's changed. Gilbert Metcalf, who's a Tufts University professor and new CCL advisory board member, along with James Stack of Harvard, recently published their research on the actual carbon tax impact in 31 European countries. What was the impact on economic growth and jobs? The results are very encouraging. Carbon taxes have had no negative effect on GDP growth rate or unemployment, and maybe slightly positive in some cases. In other words, there's no basis for the view that carbon taxes kill growth or jobs. So there are five main economic takeaways. First, the fee is effective. Second, innovation will take off, as shown by Nobel economist Paul Romer. Third, health benefits, local pollution reduction, and other co-benefits not captured in the modeling will be significant. Fourth, the economy will continue to grow just fine. And fifth, the dividend is the most equitable policy. I just want to mention one good example of the impact of a carbon fee. The United Kingdom imposed a carbon tax, they called it a carbon price floor, on coal and gas for power generation, which caused an 85% decline in coal use from 2014 to 2017. The UK imposed it on top of the European Union cap and trade program, which was stagnant at about $5 to $9 a ton from 2012 to 2017. There are several significant misunderstandings about the fee and dividend policy, but I'm just going to address one of those. Some groups hold the view that industry will pass on all the carbon fee to consumers and continue their business as usual polluting. That's not the case. In fact, the carbon fee affects all industry, businesses, government, utilities, and consumers, some greatly, some less so. Billions of investment and consumption decisions are affected each day. Not something you can say about cap and trade and the regulatory subsidy approach. Most industries have to absorb some of the rising energy input costs. A recent study showed that selected industries pass on 25 to 75% of their fossil energy costs to consumers. depending upon the industry's competitive position, market power, and availability of consumer alternatives. In addition, industry also shifts some of the burden back up to the fossil energy suppliers they use by switching to clean energy options. Let's move into that dividend, household dividend, carbon dividend. As you know, probably, it consists of a full share for up to 2 adults, half a share for children up to age 18. So a family of 4 gets about $2,000 a year in year 3, over $3,000 a year in year 5, and approaching $4,000 a year in year 10. That surprises a lot of people when they hear that number. Why do you do this dividend? This is becoming more and more important in my mind. Everyone has a view on the use of the large revenues. So why this household dividend? And there are 2 big reasons. One, as I've said, the dividend is the most equitable of all the policies and programs. Also, it brings long-term policy viability. People will like it and advocate for continuity of the fee. And it's important to note that the economist statement of 3,500 economists, including Nobel Prize winners, heads of the Federal Reserve, and President's Council and Economic Advisors, they advocated, along with the fee, a dividend instead of tax cuts. They opted for equity over traditional economist efficiency. It is, as I said, let's move on to this chart of the Treasury Department. It's the most equitable, and 2/3 of the households break even or come out ahead. It disproportionately benefits lower income households. What are the alternative uses, the other ways of using the revenue? And here's where you get into the issue of payroll, personal, corporate tax cuts. Generally means the benefits disproportionately accrue to higher income households. I'll discuss the impact of using the revenues for clean energy programs, which some major organizations recommend at the end, with some brief comments on cap and trade and regulations and subsidies. Now, I took out the British Columbia slide, which I just explained to you, and I've substituted for you the Canada's dividend. British Columbia was a model for Canada, and Canada's dividend is working. Let's look at the political impact of the dividend approach. Canada's carbon tax policy has a dividend, it's in quotes, because it's provided to households through a tax credit. Remember the slide at the start showing 3 main concerns people have and how the dividend addresses them? Concerns were personal costs, impact on low-income households, and the belief the government wants to keep the money. All 3 of these concerns are met by Canada's implementation. They started a carbon tax of $20 a ton last April 2019, designed to increase $10 a ton to $50 a ton by 2022. That's impressive. No other country in the world is doing this. At the start of the carbon tax year, April 1st, they give the household tax credit at the same time as raising the tax, just like HR 763 puts the dividend at the start. Most households come out ahead. There are 2 major findings from this that validate the carbon dividend concept. The policy was vindicated in the 2019 federal elections, despite strong conservative opposition. And second, the tax predictability and continuity was maintained last month in the face of the coronavirus economic crash. Prime Minister Trudeau was quoted as saying, "Our plan on pricing pollution puts more money up front into people's pockets than they would pay with the new price on pollution. We're going to continue to focus on putting more money in people's pockets to support them right across the country." This is the early, strong validation of the carbon fee and dividend policy. How is the dividend administered? Don't try to read all this. Basically, the carbon dividend proposes to use existing procedures plus a new form for those who don't submit taxes. Now, as you've been seeing today, you read about the IRS's issues and problems in trying to get this $1,200 CARES Act payment out. There are similarities to our dividend approach. What the IRS is doing right now is figuring out how to find all the eligible households and how to pay them. This is a dry run test that will pave the way for CCL's household dividend. The border carbon adjustment, I think, is a must-have feature to succeed on a global basis, and maybe the least discussed. But the European Union is now raising this and will begin considering it in the next year or 2 years, depending upon coronavirus economics. So what is a border carbon adjustment? It's two things. It's a tariff, basically a tax, placed on goods imported from or a rebate on goods exported to countries without an equivalent price on carbon. The tariff and rebate are based on the carbon content of the goods imported and exported. The terms duties, tariffs, and levies are often used interchangeably. So let's use Brazil as an example. Assume the US has a carbon fee and Brazil doesn't. So the adjustment has two parts. A tariff on goods imported from Brazil, where there's no equivalent price on carbon, and a rebate on US exports to Brazil. A Brazilian firm doesn't have to pay a carbon fee and has an unfair advantage over its US competitor. It can export to the US and undercut the US firm that has higher costs due to the fee. So we impose a tariff on the Brazilian import to level the playing field. And when a US company tries to export to Brazil, it won't be competitive. So a rebate is paid to the US company based on the carbon content of the exported product. If Brazil establishes its own comparable carbon fee, then there are no carbon duties or rebates either way. So why do you need this? As previously mentioned, the household dividend addresses the fairness issues for household, and the border carbon adjustment addresses the fairness issue for industry. It's critical to avoid adverse industry impacts that could come from countries without a carbon fee. So CCL's talking point is it removes any incentive for US industries to move to countries without a comparable carbon price. It avoids exporting pollution, or in economic terms, it avoids leakage. It's likely many countries will try to avoid imposing their own carbon fee and let others carry the burden. They are free riders in economic terms. Research and experience on economic trading show that the idealistic ambition of the Paris Agreement will not be sufficient to get countries to adopt significant climate programs. So which industries are at risk? Those who use a lot of energy and face international trade competition. There's a term for industries that use a lot of fossil energy, and a lot is defined as 5% or more of production, and are exposed to trade competition. That is, 15% of their product is traded. It's called, terrible acronym, Energy Intensive Trade Exposed, EITE. Generally, there's not much harm at low carbon prices, $10 to $15. But let me give you a real world example of a rising carbon tax and no border adjustment. In the case of British Columbia, greenhouses, flowers and vegetables I'm talking about, suffered competitively at $24 a ton in 2012 and were exempted. California and Mexican greenhouses undercut them because they had no similar carbon price. And you have to keep in mind that the impact was in a Canadian province that could not impose a border carbon adjustment. So this will give you a sense of which industries are most exposed. Less than 10% of industries. Most industries' energy costs average about 2% of production costs, and something I was not fully aware of. So a $25 a ton carbon tax would increase production cost in electric utilities grossly on the average of about 20%. Cement and petrochemicals about 10%, aluminum, iron, steel, lime and gypsum, fertilizer, and paper about 5%. So who administers all this? Again, existing institutions, the Department of Commerce, International Trade Association, Customs and Border Protection. The funds collected are separate from the carbon fee, and the funds cover administrative costs, and U.S. imports more goods than it exports, so the fund's going to build up over time. Legal obstacles I won't really go into too much, but I think those are manageable under the General Agreement on Tariff and Trade. There are a couple of pertinent provisions, but the most critical one is probably Article 20. It's known as General Exceptions rule to this. And why does it allow an exception? It allows discriminatory practice for environmental reasons. And it's necessary to protect human, animal, or plant health, life, relates to the conservation of exhaustible natural resources. You will find that language in the preamble of the Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act. So CCL is working toward a national carbon fee, but climate change is global. So the US policy must be one that addresses the free rider problem, incentivizes countries to participate, and is a good fit for developing countries with weak institutions, corruption, and income inequality. So the CCL policy meets these requirements. And you have to think about regional approaches like RGGI in New England, and state approaches are useful and important, but cannot bring that international outcome. So how do you get to a global agreement? And there's increasing discussion of this because of the failure twice of Article 6, I believe it is, in the Paris agreements to come into agreement on carbon pricing, trading, etc., which is cap and trade and offsets, a whole nother subject. Maybe the most pragmatic and promising path to harmonize global pricing is a multilateral carbon pricing agreement among a subset of nations. Call it a club. The club would have a border carbon adjuster around it that incentivizes others to join. For example, the US, Canada, Europe, China, India could form a club with a border carbon adjustment that would incentivize others to join. The Paris Agreement is based on ambition, has no enforcement, and is unlikely to achieve the necessary reductions. So in summary, the fee works by raising the fuel prices, which reduces demand and emissions. That rising price affects all sectors, impacts innovation and investment, and has benign economic impacts. The revenue use goes back to the people as the most equitable approach. The dividend protects households and builds that constituency support, and other options are regressive generally. The border carbon adjustment addresses the unfair foreign competition and encourages free rider companies to countries to adopt the fee. It incentivizes global carbon pricing. Now, I just want to go quickly through some observations on regulation, cap and trade. CCL volunteers will increasingly be asked, why not regulations and subsidies or cap and trade? The experience shows the following. Subsidies have been inequitable based on a major University of California, Berkeley analysis. Regulations cost more and are less effective, as described in the recent IMF analysis, how to mitigate climate change. Using the revenues from the carbon fee for clean energy subsidies has two equity downsides. First, households don't get the dividend, And second, clean energy subsidies, as I said, go disproportionately to higher income households. Only 10% of the benefits went to the bottom 60%, and the upper 20% received 60% of the benefits. And the most inequitable tax credit program was for electric vehicles, where upper 20% got 90% of the benefits. The recent International Monetary Fund analysis on cap and trade regulations options showed that those two approaches are more costly by 50 to 120 to 40% respectively, and they achieved less emission reductions. So what does this mean? It's my central message here, I think, is that fee and dividend is the foundational policy that is primary and essential. And then truly complementary regulations and subsidies can augment. What is the sound role for regulation and subsidies? Some experts suggest the following guideline, actually the Canadians, for determining when subsidies and regulations are justified. First, when a carbon fee does not impact a sector's emissions at all, for example, enteric fermentation, cow burps, soil carbon sequestration. And second, when the fee does not impact a sector sufficiently, such as rental housing, then complementary regulation would be justified, such as housing codes and efficiency programs. That, I think, is an important sequencing and relationship between CCL's carbon fee and dividend and the issue of regulations and subsidies.
Bob, you absolutely delivered again. You're the reason why you're one of the most popular trainings on the CCL circuit. We want to just thank you before we go to Q&A for your expertise. And we're so grateful for all of you joining us tonight. We hope you found tonight's training useful, and stay safe out there, our friends. Have a great night.
Thanks. Good question.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Citizens Climate Lobby's training program. You can tune into more episodes anywhere podcasts are available. Inspired by what you heard today? Join Citizens Climate Lobby to advocate for bipartisan climate solutions. Go to community.citizensclimate.org to find more trainings, resources, your local chapter, national action teams, discussion forums, and more. Be sure to like our Facebook page and follow us on Twitter and Instagram @CitizensClimate. We also invite all of our listeners to subscribe to our YouTube channel for more inspiration. And together, we are creating the political will for a livable world.